I'm going to talk about bass lines now. We've made our simple bass patch. We need to learn how to use it, like how to write bass parts for our songs and put the sound to use. So I want to define just a couple words. First is bass, which I think I've just defined before, which just means low frequency. It's the low part of our hearing spectrum. So we usually say treble is the high end of our hearing, and then that's the bass. So the other word is line. In music, a line is like a melody. So if you hear someone saying, oh, he played a beautiful line, or that's a really cool line, that means the melody that they played is really cool. Or I like the way those lines move. If you say had a few instruments and they were playing melodies at the same time, someone would describe that as lines moving lines. So a bass line is basically just a bass melody. It's the melody or the line that the bass plays. And that could be an electric bass, like a bass guitar. It could be synthesizers. It could be stand-up bass in an orchestra. Anything that can play those low notes can play bass lines. Now, the function of a bass line is to play the lowest notes in the song. So as a chord is playing, the bass is probably going to be playing the root note of that chord, but even lower than the chord is, like an octave lower than the chord is played. And when you play bass notes, they actually make the upper notes sound different. So maybe I can give an example of that. I'm just gonna open up a piano. So check this out. Here's a C major chord. Now the root note of this chord, of course, is C. So if you recall about your chords that we talked about in the last section, now a bass would usually play a C underneath this, like would play the root note of the chord, but probably this low, this C. In fact, I'll just turn the whole piano down one octave. We'll do like this. So here I'm playing a C chord and a C root note, and they gel perfectly together, because that's often what happens is that the bass sound, whatever it happens to be, plays the root note of the chord that you're playing. But it's possible to play other notes underneath the chord, just as an example. So if I'm playing a C major chord, but I put, let's say, how about an F? Now, notice that the C major chord feels different. Here it is by itself, but here's the bass note. I'll put the bass note down an octave. Feels different. How about an A? Feels different. How about a D? Different again. So the bass note has an amazing quality, which it colors or changes how all the notes above it feel. So the bass note is kind of like the note that brings all the other ones together and organizes them and makes sense out of them. So even if you think you're playing a certain chord, if you don't play the right bass note with it, it's going to change the whole feeling of the chord. So it's very important to understand what bass notes you're playing with what chords or what melodies, because it's going to change how those things feel. Now, what notes should you play when you're writing your bass line? There's actually a lot of possibilities, but for now, we're just going to play root notes and octaves of root notes. So I was playing C major there, played here, and I have a C in the bass, let's say, this guy. Now, I'm probably going to hold that or play some rhythm with that root note while the C chord is playing, and then I can also play the octave of that note. So I can play this note or this note, and I can alternate them back and forth. That's an example of a bass line where I'm playing only root notes. I'm only playing the root note of the chord, but I'm allowed to play the lowest root note and then the octave of that root note. There's something else to be said here, which is that if you go too low, it's not going to sound good. So check this out. Here's a low C. Here's an even lower C. This is super low. Like if we start going lower than this C, things don't sound very good. And because this is a piano, it's not going to have many notes that are even lower than that. Here's the lowest note on a real piano. And if I go any lower than it, it doesn't play any sound because that note doesn't actually exist on a real piano. And it's very rare to even hear this note be played. This is more what you're gonna hear when someone plays a bass note. Or here's a low E, A, D. But if you start going lower than this, it gets ugly and it doesn't really work with the rest of the music very well. So just because you're playing the right note, technically, I'm gonna switch to my Mai Tai and give another example. Just because you're playing the right note technically, here's a very, very low C. But if I go lower than this, check out the next lowest C. It doesn't even sound like a note anymore. What you're hearing there is the individual peaks of the waveform. And if I go even lower, now you're still hearing the peaks. But when it's in the proper range, you won't be able to pick out those individual peaks and it will sound like a real note. So if I descend, I'm really not going to play many notes lower than this. Maybe this one, but this is getting too low, way too low. Because it doesn't sound musical anymore. It just sounds like a, I don't know, super low farting noise in this case. So it's of no use to us to play those. So we want to play the root notes of our chords, but we want to put them in the proper octave. If we play them too high, like this, it doesn't sound like a bass anymore. It just sounds like any other part of the song. Could be a melody, could be part of the chord, but putting it down here, these places, this is more like what a bass line is, in the octave that a bass should be played. The next thing is rhythms. So what rhythms should you play with your bass? Well, the rhythm can either just follow the chords. I'll switch back to my piano. So say I was playing whatever, C major and A minor. I could follow this rhythm with my bass, so I'll play my bass here. Here's my C, there's my A, so I could play C, A. That's the simplest thing to do. The bass is just playing the root note of each chord, and it's playing it at the same time the chord plays. Now, you could split that up and play octaves of the bass note like this. So now for every one chord, I have two bass notes, and the bass notes are the root note and the octave of the root note. Or I could come up with different rhythms that are separate from the rhythm the chord's playing. So it could be add octaves in. So you see, the bass line doesn't have to play the same rhythm that the chord is playing. It just has to change when the chord changes. Because if the bass note doesn't follow the chord, it's going to make the chord sound strange, like it's not going to make sense anymore. So you want your bass note to change when your chord changes, but the bass note can play different rhythms. And often the rhythm that the bass notes are going to play either is going to follow the chords or is going to somehow follow the drums or be dictated by the drums. Now we have no drums in this song right now, so I'm not going to do that, but shortly we're going to do that, where we put a drum loop in, and then the different places where the drums hit might decide, or help me decide, where I'm going to put my bass notes, so that the bass notes get tied to the rhythm of the drums and they kind of act as one unit. But the point being, when chords play, bass notes play usually. A bass part will play the root of that chord, and it will change to the root of the new chord when you switch to that chord. But those notes don't need to play in the exact same rhythm that the chords play. They can play different rhythms so long as they change when the chord changes. That's what I'm trying to get across. So that's the information we need to know about writing bass lines. And in the next video, we're actually going to do that. I'm going to play some chord progressions and then write some bass lines to show you kind of how that's done.